How many wide receivers will have immediate impact from the 2024 NFL Draft class for fantasy? And what's their outlook for dynasty and keeper leagues? It's time to break it down for 12 scouting reports with this edition of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your fantasy football team every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL, fantasy, betting, the draft, free agency, everything in the league for sportingnews.com. This is the final show of the week as I get you prepped for the 2024 NFL Draft with the key skill position players. We went through our three-part mock draft for round one, and we examined the receivers at the top: Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze. Here we're going to look at 12 more receivers. Given how active and productive some of these rookie wide receivers were in the 2023 class, this class is loaded. We're going to have almost all these guys taken in the first two rounds. So we'll start right away with Brian Thomas Jr., get all the way down to a pick that the Bears could really like here in round three. So we'll cover those 12 wide receivers, give you quick scouting reports, what we can expect in fantasy based on potential landing spots from these players on today's show. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. All right, one more first rounder that we can throw into the mix with the three I mentioned. The guy that I think is standing out is Brian Thomas Jr., 6'4", 205 pounds, out of LSU. So Neighbors' teammates, another pair of LSU guys here in the mix. The Bills, again, we talked about Curtis Samuel being a kind of inside option. Khalil Shakir is a slot guy. Stephon Diggs is a little bit smaller. They lost Gabe Davis. So we really like Brian Thomas there. He's got great size. But again, Brian Thomas would fit in a lot of places. I also liked him to the Chiefs at one point here, but the Bills really need to go after this position early to get that standout edge here before the first round run ends. So Brian Thomas Jr., again, I want him to land on the Bills. That gives him the best fantasy potential here of the first rounders. We looked at it. Harrison, definitely the top, and it really goes down from there. Neighbors and Odunze for fantasy, but there's some other guys that can have some appeal. Thomas, again, is going to have to fight for targets a little bit with the Bills. So we wouldn't be too hot on him necessarily, right? Because we have now Samuel in the mix who can get a volume of targets. Shakir should have a bigger role there. Diggs, we'll see. I think what you're waiting for is year two, something that didn't really happen with Gabe Davis in year three to kind of take over in a key role here, right? So you also have to worry about Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox at tight end, James Cook out of the backfield. So Brian Thomas Jr., the Bills aren't the greatest, I think, fantasy landing spot. I think they can emerge that way maybe in a year or two. So Dynasty Keeper Leagues, I like Thomas a little bit more than his immediate impact if he lands on a team like that. Now, there's some teams out there that a player could go to, and this is one of them. The New England Patriots, where the value would shoot through the roof because there's not a lot there. The Patriots are kind of piecemealing their wide receiver core together. They haven't been good at drafting wide receivers. We know that. They're looking for some answers. They got KJ Osborne. That was their biggest acquisition so far. So, look, I think this is going to be a run-heavy team, but there's going to be one wide receiver who can stand out. Now, if they get Jaden Daniels or Drake May in the first round, they need a guy to stretch the field. So I gave them 80 and Adonai Mitchell. It's pretty close between Mitchell and Xavier Worthy, two absolute speedsters from Texas playing with Quinn Ewers and that explosive offense last season there. So Mitchell is got a little bit bigger size, so definitely 6'2", 205 here. I think he's a good target for the Patriots. Again, you're going to go get Jaden Daniels. He's got a big arm. Drake May also can rifle it with a cannon down the field. So when you look at this, A.D. Mitchell really has a lot of appeal as a field stretcher. I also liked him on the Chiefs before they went after Marquise Brown. They could still think about him at the end of the first round. He could be in play for the Panthers and Chargers as well if he gets beyond that spot there. And those would be good landing spots, we know, because, again, Chargers have a lot of vacated targets. If they don't go for a wide receiver in round one, there's going to be an opportunity there. But Mitchell, again, the speed is there, but again, he's probably going to be a little bit more inconsistent because of that speed profile. Now, I think one guy that could land in a really good spot and be very productive is Troy Franklin out of Oregon, 6'2", 176 pounds. I have him going right now to the Chargers in round 2. I think he's the ideal guy to get in that mix. He was Bo Nix's target, and they could also try to reunite Bo Nix with him, depending on who drafts Nix, maybe the Broncos. And they need some help there with the Tim Patrick injury and Jerry Jeudy being traded. So another team to look at there for Franklin, but they don't pick for a while. The Chargers, this is why I think they could go Brock Bowers in round 1, because they're going to have a lot of good wide receivers who can stretch the field for their needs here in round 2. Really just all kinds of options to replace Keenan Allen and or Mike Williams going forward beyond the first round. So if he lands there, it's an Oregon and Oregon type connection here. A little bit of separation, but Herbert, is going to feel good about someone who came from the Ducks as well. So 6'2", 176, very good receiver all around. Might be a sleeper that could sneak into the first round as well, but another talent here that has the potential to really deliver in fantasy football. So again, Franklin, I think when you look at Thomas and Mitchell, based on the landing spots, I think Franklin might end up in a spot where he could be isolated a little bit more for targets and production than Thomas and Mitchell. But I think longer term, I like Thomas. I think the shorter term, I like Franklin. Mitchell, I'm somewhat in between, based on the landing spot because of his nature as a deep threat. Now, same thing I feel about Xavier Worthy. I really like him. He flew at the combine with his 40-yard dash, and there was a lot of promise to like there. The Panthers have been attached a lot to them or him, whether you look at the early pick that they have in the second round, but they also trade away Brian Burns, so they could be looking at edge rusher help first. They also have Jonathan Mingo they can explore behind Adam Thielen and Deontay Johnson. So all kinds of things you can look at, but Worthy is the kind of guy that would replace DJ Chark and kind of stretching the field. I think he would be an upgrade over Marshall, who they've had, Terrace Marshall Jr. and Mingo. This guy's 5'1", 165. Keep in mind, new coaching staff, new general manager, Dan Morgan leading the way with Dave Canales. So they want a Mike Evans type guy to take the top off of defense, stretch the field. We know Johnson and Thielen can't do that. So 5'11", 165 for Worthy. Plays a little bit bigger than that, but can flat out fly. So love that as a selection for the Panthers. And those are some guys I like going late round 1, early round 2 that can really have a fantasy football impact. There's a lot more round 2 guys. This is how good this class is. Again, you could have 15 receivers go in the top 60 picks and no one would think twice about it. That's how good this wide receiver class is. And we'll explore 8 more guys that could actually have some fantasy football impact. Definitely some reality rookie impact coming here in 2024. This episode, Locked On Fantasy Football, is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. As we said, the number one sportsbook in America. Say goodbye to your busted brackets. You still could be losing some teams here after the first games in the third round, headed to the Sweet 16 to the Elite 8. Well, because now FanDuel can let you bet on every game of the tournament. So you can rebound quickly, turn around, no worry about busted brackets where you are in the pool, because every game is a new pool for you. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a number 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's number 1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on your point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets there in Phoenix at the Final Four. All right, we do have to talk about some more exciting wide receivers on today's show, giving you some quick scouting reports, looking at rookie potential fantasy football impact, as well as looking dynasty and keeper. And one thing that you do want to put on your radar, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn on the volume with all that shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysts, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels up, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The next wide receiver on my board here is Ladd McConkey. Yeah, I love this player. He's very productive. I don't think he got as much attention until this past year, as we didn't have George Pickens and some of these other guys that were in the mix for Georgia. 6'0", 186 is his size here. So more of a kind of a hybrid guy, short area, can do a little bit of field stretching, good in the red zone. So I think he's a great fit to replace Curtis Samuel. I mentioned him going to the Bills in free agency for the Commanders. I think this is a good spot for him. With the way they use the field here, he can play in between and maybe help Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson with some route versatility here on this team to replace Samuel, short area guy that I like, has some scoring potential like we saw at Samuel. Again, Samuel was a bit of a wide receiver 3 sleeper. I don't think you'll see that again. I think they want to get Jahan Dotson more involved, but Dotson is the field stretcher. Well, I think they want to get McConkey a little bit more involved. They've switched up tight end. They do have Zach Ertz and Austin Eckler, so keep in mind the targets might be limited, but I do like the fact that the Commanders get that QB Drake May or Jane Daniels, they could have some really nice weapons for that player. We already said Eckler and Ertz add to that haul here with McLaurin and Dotson, and now you add a third receiver like this, a little bit more dynamic than Samuel overall, just a better receiver, I think, than Samuel was coming in. McConkey's very technically sound. He's very good at getting all over the field. I do like this. Again, fantasy, we're going to wait and see, but again, he has a potential to take over. If there's any disappointment with Jahan Dotson in this new offense, where the production, they've been fickle about it, I think he could really emerge as a key target here for Cliff Kingsbury in Washington. Again, a lot of options there for McConkey. I thought the Falcons also might be good staying there, but now they have a bit of a crowd with Darnell Mooney and some of the others they've acquired to help Drake London. So, yeah, all kinds of options, but I do like him, sneaky guy who can produce. And now Xavier Legette out of South Carolina, another guy we're going to watch out for. The Colts have a potential here with their wide receiver opposite Michael Pittman Jr. Now they've seen some of Josh Downs. They've seen some of Alec Pierce. We've had their moments with both wide receivers. They should also be looking at tight end. But Shane Steichen, what do we have? We have 2 reliable receivers. We know going back to Philadelphia, you had that with the Chargers as well. Philadelphia was, of course, Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown. So I think they want that type of combination where you have that one guy that you can trust all over the field, Michael Pittman. So he's kind of the Devonta Smith of the situation. And then Alec Pierce, they've tried to force him to be maybe the field stretcher. I think with Josh Downs, he's had some moments with his quickness inside, but Legette would give them that 6'1", 221. He was right there with Xavier Worthy, but I think Worthy separated there among the Xavier wide receiver named guys because of speed, but still very effective, can take a top off of defense, can be very effective. The Colts have been eyeing him quite a bit, much like the Panthers have been tied with Worthy. So I have him Legette going in round 2. And again, if he lands with the Colts, there's going to be something I'm going to watch there. Whoever lands with the Colts among these wide receivers or tight ends, because again, there's some potential. I know there's not too much vacated there, but I think they want to clean up their tight end mess, trying to get one true receiver that they can trust next after Pittman. So definitely the Colts are maybe that sleeper team in the passing game. Now, the Steelers need some help at wide receiver. They have George Pickens, but they traded away Deontay Johnson to get Dante Jackson from the Panthers. So now they're looking at trying to add another receiver. And Keon Coleman makes sense. Now, I think his star kind of diminished a little bit, that he could have been a borderline first-round pick, but didn't round as well. But I don't think that's what they're looking for necessarily in this. They want more of a guy they can trust all over the field with the routes. George Pickens is going to be more of the home run threat. They also have the quickness of Calvin Austin in the mix if they wanted to go that way in Pittsburgh. So Keon Coleman, I think, is a good fit there. Steelers around 6'3", 213, so can also operate as a big slot, make some big plays on the outside, but really appealing player for sure here from Florida State. And Florida State has another option as well that we'll get into later, but Johnny Wilson is a guy that would go later in the draft that might have some appeal as kind of a wide receiver tight end hybrid, a kind of a Marcus Colston, poor man's type here that has some potential there. But this receiver, Coleman, again, can get all over the field and open. Again, he's going to be more of a PPR, half-point PPR type player here versus a guy that you're going to trust there to make the big plays and get the job done. So Coleman, we need some volume, and the Steelers definitely have some volume opportunities there. Now, the final receiver that I'm going to talk about here is Javon Baker. I really like him. He's really risen up the boards here. 6'1", 202, very reliable slot option. Right now, the Texans here, if they're looking at him in round 2, they do have Noah Brown. They brought him back, but technically you have Nico Collins and Tank Dell being their outside receivers. So again, I wouldn't mind a little bit more depth at receiver for the Texans. Again, they did bring back Dalton Schultz, but I think Noah Brown is limited. I think there's an opening there for Baker, and they also have Tank Dell coming off a major injury. So they need a little bit of depth there to keep us going. So I think it's going to take a little bit for Baker to have any impact if he lands with the Texans, for that matter, any wide receiver that goes there. But kind of slot guy that has some potential. They're at 6'1", 202 pounds. They're out of UCF. So rising up draft board, someone we're going to pay attention to. And again, we're going to keep our eye on everyone because we saw what happened with Puka Nacua. We want to pay attention to depth charts, how things are playing out here. And Nacua was a late rising person there that they took in the draft, and the Rams kind of was an afterthought until we had some reports from training camp preseason. So these wide receivers can come from anywhere to have immediate impact in rookie seasons. And again, a very strong class where we can pluck a few guys that are going to be underdrafted in the NFL. They're going to end up being very strong fantasy assets. So that's why we want to go 12 deep. So we'll go 4 more in our final segment on the show, but essentially our top 12 wide receivers after the big three. So top 15 wide receivers is what we're covering here. And again, if you missed our look at the big three of Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze, you can check that in the feed. But we still have 4 more guys to talk about on the show. Make sure you're checking out all the great shows and the mock draft coming up here with all the team correspondents on the Locked On Network. Good stuff there. It's the first ever national streaming channel. You can watch it on there 24/7. Of course, that's going to be part of it as well. But can't wait to see the Locked On mock draft here with all our team shows making their picks here for 2024. All right. It is time to continue the show and look at our next group of wide receivers, rounding out our top 15. Again, we had the 3 that we had at the top. We went through now essentially the next 8. Now 4 more to look at. Now we're going to dip our toes into round 3. So this covers most of the early day 1, day 2 prospects in the draft. And we'll get to deep sleepers at one point here when we get closer to the draft and look at these receivers. But let's start here with Ricky Pearsall. He's got some more attention. He's a guy that can do a little bit of everything. Technically sound on the outside. He's pretty much a perimeter receiver, though he's 6'1", 189. He has some big playability as well. The Detroit Lions have looked at Jameson Williams, but their third receiver right now is Khalif Raymond. We know that Amon-Ra St. Brown lines up in the slot. So they're looking for a second receiver there, an upgrade, a younger upgrade. They're ahead of Josh Reynolds. Raymond had his moments there. Now, this is something to watch for the Lions and their next receiver here, because Williams starts to disappoint. This player has an opening there to see more key targets, kind of thing they developed in Los Angeles, where we saw some things fading with Puka Nacua. So Ricky Pearsall, you're looking at him with the Lions in the scheme. I do think he has a chance to really be successful. Round 2 is where you'll find it. Again, the Lions really need to focus on the outside. There's a lot of slot guys that you can usually find in the late second, early third round, but for the Lions in particular with ARSB special row, I think you have to think more outside and big plays here. So again, Pearsall, again, pretty good all-around receiver on the rise here. Now, Alabama, they cannot be avoiding this wide receiver run in the draft. They always seem to have a wide receiver now that we're going to pay attention to. This year, it's more of a technical slot guy in Jermaine Burton. Now, we know the Ravens have an affinity for Alabama players, going back to the Ozzie Newsome days. They've translated that to Eric DeCosta. Now, they did bring back Nelson Aguilar, but not interested in Odell Beckham Jr., and we know that Rashad Bateman has kind of been just a guy here, and Zay Flowers has been standing up. And Aguilar flashed his moments, but he's getting a little older. He's not necessarily back in a long-term deal. So Burton is someone we're going to look at beyond this year to see what they do with Bateman and the slot here with Aguilar, and then behind Zay Flowers, someone's going to have to develop clearly as the number 2, whether he's lining up inside or outside with Flowers. So Burton definitely has that potential. 6'0", 196. I like him with the Ravens there in my mock draft. Now, Jalen McMillan is another wide receiver from Washington. Yeah, it's not just Rome Odunze. It's actually McMillan and Ja'Lynn Polk. I really like these guys as well. So all 3 key Washington wide receivers for Michael Penix Jr. should be drafted here by the 3rd round. So this is where we're transitioning into the 3rd round here from Pearsall and Burton to McMillan and Polk. And let's start with Jalen McMillan. Now, I have him go to the Bears in round 3, 6'1", 197 pounds. Now, We saw that Odunze was the headline grabber with the big plays, but McMillan's a technical sound guy. Now, I did mention attaching the Chargers to Troy Franklin out of Oregon, but to me, the Chargers need multiple wide receivers. It's kind of like the Packers we've seen in recent drafts, taking multiple wide receivers, getting some options. Well, the Chargers need options. Now, I know they're not going to be as crazy passing. They do have a ton of vacated targets, right? But that's going to be kind of mitigated by the fact that they're not going to pass as much, so not as many targets, but they still have to throw to somebody. They still don't have a tight end, so we have to see how it plays out with Brock Bowers. If they want to go after him, I mean, it's questionable that Will Dissly or Hayden Hurst would be that guy, but they're not really going in with Josh Palmer and what they have with the Quentin Dots. I mean, they're just not going Quentin Johnson. It's just not going to happen here. So when we're looking at this, yeah, they need to upgrade again. New GM, new coaching. We talked about that. They're going to think in a different way. McMillan, we know that Jim Harbaugh had a very close look at him on the other side in the national championship game for Washington. So he's a good target here for the Chargers if they want to double up on wide receivers early. It shouldn't be a shock here because, again, they try to keep their defense intact, so they could go really aggressively for the offense here in the draft. And I do like this pick here. Jalen McMillan going to the Chargers in round 3. Now, their other Washington receiver is more of a guy that you can line up everywhere, has some juice. McMillan, I think, would be more of the traditional slot that you're looking at, so he would be a good replacement for Keenan Allen. While you look at Ja'Lynn Polk, I think he's more of the outside stretcher guy with Rome Odunze. So when you look at that, I mean, he can do a little bit of everything. The Bears kind of need to replace Darnell Mooney. They have Keenan Allen for the slot and DJ Moore, but they really need a third receiver they can trust a little bit more. They've tried out Velus Jones. It hasn't quite worked out for him. Again, they could have a little bit more 12 personnel, as we know with Shane Waldron, but we also know Waldron is open to using those 3 wide receivers like we saw with DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Najigba. So there are a lot of correlations here as they go there because Shane Waldron was paying attention to Washington as he moves from Seattle. So this could be something that the Bears think about here. So I don't think the Bears are going to invest that high pick. Again, they've been attached to Odunze as well in the first round. But again, I think you want to see more of a player like this. So you have DJ Moore and Keenan Allen maintaining things and Odunze landing somewhere else to have that bigger impact here out of Washington. But yeah, 3 receivers from Washington that you can definitely think about here in the draft. Very good stuff to consider here. And again, wrapping this up, what we have here, and last year we had a lot of relevant fantasy wide receivers, right? So going back, I mean, really it was very efficient with receivers, and it's going to be hard to duplicate. But that said, I think there's a lot of options here. Now, very interesting the way it played out last year. I mean, I'm just really impressed how much that class really dominated. So if you look at half-point PPR, it was crazy. You had Puka Nacua, of course, leading all rookies. He was the number 4 leading overall scorer. I mean, that's impressive as it is. And you keep going down, and you keep finding guys that had a lot of value here. And you had Jordan Addison come in at wide receiver 21. That's pretty darn good. You had good stuff from Rashee Rice. He was 27. You had Zay Flowers. He was 29. So a lot of rookies contributing last year. And I think it could just keep getting better here. Jaden Reed, we know, came on strong near the end. So again, that's somebody you can expect to have some immediate impact right away. Yeah, Jackson Smith and Najigba was a little bit buried there. But when you start looking at rookie wide receivers, you're looking at probably 6 to 8 having good impact here as fantasy assets all across the board, right? Nacua is probably an exception, and he's not going to happen every year, no matter what round a player was taken in, but we've also seen Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, so there's a good chance that Marvin Harrison will be that guy this year, and then everything else will kind of fall into place there as wide receiver 2s and 3s and all those options. But this wide receiver class, very talented top to bottom, from Marvin Harrison, you can keep on going. I mean, we just scratched the surface of the guys that are there. There's some really nice deep sleepers. Malachi Corley was the next guy I was going to mention out of Denver or Western Michigan going to Denver. So I look at this and just like there's a receiver for everybody, inside, outside, whatever scheme you're running. We know every team is trying to incorporate 3 receivers for the most part. So really love this class. And again, 6 to 8, you can hope to have some value now. More than that, of course, for value in dynasty and keeper leagues here. So pay attention to all of them. Look at what they're doing. look at the scouting reports, the team they landed with, the vacated targets, their role. There's all kinds of things to explore going forward. And we're just getting started. We don't know what teams these guys are on, but it's fun to speculate, fun to look at what these guys can bring based on their skill set to the NFL. All right, that wraps up this week of our draft analysis here for you, mock draft, and looking at the wide receivers for you on Locked On Fantasy Football. On the next show, Monday, Michelle Majuk will be back, and she'll be having much more fantasy goodness for you with a variety of guests as well. But catching up on the draft, have a good spring break, and I'll catch you on the flip side here. Bye, y'all.